This week, we have one of the most serious questions about the Bible you've ever been asked. Did Adam have a belly button? Let's find out. Hey everyone, I'm Colin, the resident nerd and Bible scholar here on the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. And we're having a little bit of fun this week, asking the question, did Adam and or Eve have belly buttons? Now, as ridiculous as this question may sound to some of you, it's one that I have been asked a surprising number of times in my years teaching the Bible. So let's deal with it. A belly button is a sign that you were once connected to your mother in her womb. So this has become a question of if God created Adam and Eve without having any parents, would they have had a belly button because they were never connected to their mother? They never had a mother. The question's been around a while. It's kind of one of those, can God create a rock too big he can't lift sort of questions. But it's really become prominent, I guess you'd say, in the last 50 to 100 or more years due to recent debates between creationists and evolutionists. In fact, you can even find an article on Answers in Genesis, a prominent creation science group, that says Adam's not having a belly button was a testimony to all of his future generations of grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on, of how God created him. That goes quite a ways too far for me. The simple reality is we don't have any physical description of Adam and Eve in the biblical text because that's not what the authors were interested in communicating to us. And while there are plenty of Christians who have looked at that text and said, well, they didn't have mothers, so they must not have had a belly button, there are also plenty of Christians who have understood the creation accounts in Genesis to be non-literal tellings of God's creation. There have been plenty of good Christians throughout the years who have believed God used some form of evolution or some other similar process to create the world. And I know that can be a really touchy point for a lot of Christians, so I'd encourage you to go back and check out our Genesis 1 through 6 series on the podcast, where we talk more in depth about creation versus evolution and why you can be a good Christian and believe different things about how to interpret Genesis 1 and 2. There are also good Christians who interpret Adam and Eve as being representative of the whole human race. So they are symbolic to them, where they were not necessarily people who actually lived, but are used symbolically in the text to refer to humanity as a whole. So if that's the case, then this whole argument is null and void. But for the sake of argument here, let's assume that Adam and Eve were real people that God created in the garden, placed there. Did they have belly buttons? Well, again, there's nothing in the text that says one way or the other, so we cannot know for absolute sure. But if I had to choose a side on this, I would go with yes, they probably did. Here's my reasoning. If you take the Genesis accounts relatively literally and assume that God created this garden in a place called Eden and placed Adam and Eve there in the garden, then that assumes that what he created was created in a relatively mature state. There is nothing to suggest that God only created seeds that would later sprout into plants on the ground. That, this wasn't actually a garden for the next 50 years as all the trees and plants and everything grew out. Or that God only created baby forms of animals and they all had to grow. The implication in the text seems to be that God created full-blown, mature forms of everything that he created, be that animals, plants, or obviously humans. There's nothing there to suggest that Adam and or Eve were babies when they were created. Rather, they were created in a fully mature state. So if that is the case for things like plants and animals, you would have to ask the question, if they cut down a tree in the garden, would it have had any rings inside? I think at that point, it's just so reductive. There's no beneficial discussion to be had. But I do think that if God created that way so that everything looked like it had been around there for a while, it probably would have looked basically the same as something that actually had been there for a while, if that was an option. So I would think, yeah, Adam and Eve probably would have had belly buttons, probably would have looked like any other normal human. I realize that logic can get taken and used a little bit too far by creation scientists who want to say, well, then that's why the earth looks old, but it's really not old, is God just made everything look old and it's a test of faith or something like that. That, again, gets too far into the weeds on that, but we talk about all that sort of stuff in the Genesis 1 through 6 series, so I definitely recommend you check that out. Now, ultimately, while questions like this can be fun at times, we do need to be careful not to get lost in them, because it's really easy to just turn this into useless arguing over things that don't really make any significant doctrinal difference. So if you enjoy this kind of conversation, that's totally fine. But let's also remember not to get too caught up in things that good people can disagree on.